Is abortion reasonable? Much of what I say in this video in relation to the enormous question that was just raised is derived from the ideas that this textbook, Contemporary Moral Arguments, Readings, and Ethical Issues, force me to ponder. It's basically a collection of landmark arguments, often abridged, mind you, from both sides of nearly every controversial issue. Except for gay marriage, oddly enough. There's not a single chapter on rainbows in this entire book. Believe me, my boyfriend checked.
Ladies, I don't have a boyfriend. I was just joking. What are you doing for lunch?
The only real problem I have with this book is that it has a surprising amount of typos, and the introductions to each issue before you actually read any of the arguments can be a bit slanted in presentation. For instance, in the introduction to the abortion issue, the book makes a claim about Exodus chapter 21 verse 22 from the Bible that is misleading because it totally leaves out what the other side has to say about that verse and its translation. I'll leave an article on the verse and its controversy in the description below. But seriously, overall, it's a terrific book, and it is what we will be referencing throughout this video in order to answer the aforementioned question on abortion. To the pro-lifers, I say, buckle up. This video is going to challenge you. To the pro-choicers, I say, buckle up. This video is going to challenge you. Now, the two arguments we are going to be focusing on in this video are both pro-choice, but as I hope to illustrate, they are exceedingly problematic to both pro-lifers and pro-choicers. The first is titled On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion by Mary Ann Warren. Before I explain Warren's argument, I would like to point out that she correctly neglects the simple thinking that most popular pro-choicers think is solid, which is the line of thinking that says, a woman should have the right to choose what she wants to do with her body, and it is nobody's business to tell her otherwise. The problem with this train of thought is that we know for certain that a pregnant woman's body is but one of two bodies involved during an abortion. The fact that one of the bodies is not nearly as developed as the other is of no consequence regarding the fact that there are two genetically unique human organisms involved. The common slogan, "My body, my choice," is ignorant of this fact. Just think about it. When someone has a parasite feeding off of their insides, they never say, "My body is feeding off of me!" Instead, they say what any sane person would say, which is that a parasite is feeding off of me. They recognize that there is a separate entity that is inside them, a unique organism. Similarly, when women are pregnant, including pro-choice women, they never say, "My body is kicking." Instead, they say, "My baby is kicking." So you see, the my body, my choice argument should not be taken seriously, and that is why I think Warren correctly neglects it. But now on to Warren's actual argument, which should be taken seriously. Warren's argument is based on the idea that merely being a Homo sapien, a creature with human DNA, is not sufficient for personhood. And by personhood, Warren means something like fully fledged moral being. So, in other words, you have to be a fully fledged moral being in order to be considered a person with rights, such as the right to life, in her eyes. Warren argues that members of a non-human species could possess the special qualities that make me, for example, a fully fledged moral being, and that if this is true, then to deny them personhood just because they don't have human DNA would be an example of speciesism. To put it in simpler terms, just imagine that Vulcans are real. They're not human, yet we all recognize that it is just as evil to murder this guy as it is to murder this guy, because this guy is a fully fledged moral being even though he's an alien. He possesses the same qualities of personhood as this human. But what exactly are these qualities of personhood that define characters like these as fully fledged moral beings with rights, such as the right to life? This is the question Warren attempts to answer. She identifies 5 traits that are most central to personhood, which I will paraphrase now. Number 1, Consciousness and the capacity to feel pain is an important part of this. Number 2, ability to reason, like how you're reasoning as you watch this video and understand this argument. Number 3, self-motivated activity. So, like, ants do not have self-motivated activity because their tasks are hardwired into their system. They have no choice but to do what ants do. But the adult human, known as Carter Brown, does have self-motivated activity, and that he can consciously choose to talk about himself in the third person for no other reason than to be obnoxious. He has a sense of free will. Number 4, the capacity to communicate. And the 5th and last trait most central to personhood, according to Warren, is the presence of self-concepts and self-awareness. So like how when I look into a mirror and go, hey, that's me! I recognize myself and look damn good. Those are the 5 traits that Warren rests her pro-choice argument on. To be considered a person, in the fully fledged moral sense that you and I are considered persons, a being doesn't have to possess all of these traits. But surely any being that possesses none of them is certainly not a person from Warren's view. She argues that an unborn baby, a fetus, possesses none of these traits and is therefore not yet a person deserving full moral rights, such as the right to life. Therefore, abortion is morally acceptable in her view. Now, the pro-lifer may partially counter this reasoning by pointing out the fact that fetuses possess the capacity to feel pain after about 5 or 6 months into pregnancy. However, I would venture to say that Warren mentioned the capacity to feel pain as an important consideration in relation to the trait of consciousness, but by no means as important as consciousness itself. Because if you think about it, all kinds of animals have the capacity to feel pain, and yet we don't grant them the right to life. When I first examined Warren's reasoning, I thought that it was on its face a really solid argument. However, there is one gigantic problem with it. Like as big of a problem as the creative choices that turned Game of Thrones into a pile of, you know the word. I will circle back around to this problem in a little bit, but right now I'd like to address the boldest pro-choice argument I've ever come across. The philosopher Michael Tooley offers an earth-shattering argument that is terrifying to pro-lifers because it makes sense, and terrifying to pro-choicers because, well, you'll see. How can you have a right to something if you're not capable of having an interest in it? This is the underlying question of Tooley's argument, which is based on something known as the interest principle. Tooley introduces this principle in the following text. How can one determine what properties endow a being with a right to life? An approach that I believe is very promising starts out from the observation that there appear to be 2 radically different sorts of reasons for why an entity may lack a certain right. Compare, for example, the following 2 claims. 1. A child does not have a right to smoke. 2. A newspaper does not have a right not to be torn up. The first claim raises a substantive moral issue. People might well disagree about it and support their conflicting views by appealing to different moral theories. The second claim, in contrast, seems an unlikely candidate for moral dispute. It is natural to say that newspapers just are not the sort of thing that can have any rights at all, including a right not to be torn up. So there is no need to appeal to a substantive moral theory to resolve the question whether a newspaper has a right not to be torn up. One way of characterizing this difference is to say that the second claim, unlike the first, is true in virtue of a certain conceptual connection, and that is why no moral theory is needed in order to see that it is true. The explanation, then, of why it is that a newspaper does not have a right not to be torn up is that there exists some property P, such that, first, newspapers lack property P, and secondly, it is a conceptual truth that only things with property P can be possessors of rights. What might property P be? A plausible answer, I believe, is set out and defended by Joel Feinberg in his paper, The Rights of Animals and Unborn Generations. It takes the form of what Feinberg refers to as the interest principle. The sorts of beings who can have rights are precisely those who have or can have interests. And then, since interests must be compounded somehow out of conations, it follows that things devoid of desires, such as newspapers, can have neither interests nor rights. Here, then, is one account of the difference in status between judgments such as 1 and 2 above. Another obvious difference is that Claim 1 involves a living thing, whereas Claim 2 does not. I think, though, that the reason Tooley chose to make Claim 2 so outlandish was to very clearly show how the interest principle works. The right in Claim 1 can be argued about with a straight face, because a child is capable of having interests. The right in Claim 2, on the other hand, can only be argued about among complete lunatics, because not only are newspapers not alive, they definitely do not have and cannot have interests. Let us now consider the implications this has for the right to life. Reading from Tooley again. The interest principle tells us that an entity cannot have any rights at all unless it is capable of having interests. This in itself may be a conclusion of considerable importance. Consider, for example, a fertilized human egg cell. Someday it will come to have desires and interests. As a zygote, however, it does not have desires, nor even the capacity for having desires. What about interests? This depends upon the account one offers of the relationship between desires and interests. It seems to me that a zygote cannot be properly spoken of as a subject of interests. My reason is roughly this. What is in a thing's interest is a function of its present and future desires, both those it will actually have and those it could have. In the case of an entity that is not presently capable of any desires, its interests must be based entirely upon the satisfaction of future desires. Then, since satisfaction of future desires presupposes the continued existence of the entity in question, anything which has an interest which is based upon the satisfaction of future desires must also have an interest in its own continued existence. Therefore, something that is not presently capable of having any desires at all, like a zygote, cannot have any interests at all unless it has interest in its own continued existence. To add to this, it has no thoughts, no memories of the past, no forecasts of the future. It has no concept of a continuing self, which means that it's actually impossible for it to have an interest in its own continued existence, its life. Heck, it doesn't even know that it's a zygote that's alive. The crucial takeaway here, guys, is that a zygote, not unlike a newspaper, is simply not a thing capable of having any interests, which according to the interest principle means that it cannot have any rights, including the right to life. Therefore, according to Tooley, abortion is acceptable. In this next passage, Tooley quotes Joel Feinberg. His reasons for believing in the interest principle are, in my mind, very compelling, especially in combination with what we've already gone over. The sorts of beings who can have rights are precisely those who have or can have interests. I have come to this tentative conclusion for two reasons. One, because a right holder must be capable of being represented, and it is impossible to represent a being that has no interests. And two, because a right holder must be capable of being a beneficiary in his own person, and a being without interests is a being that is incapable of being harmed or benefited, having no good or sake of its own. Thus, a being without interests has no behalf to act in, and no sake to act for. A zygote, Tooley would say, has no behalf to act in and no sake to act for. But what about a more developed zygote? A fetus that's several months old and even has a rudimentary brain with the capacity to feel pain. Well, Tooley would say that fetuses of this kind are no more deserving of a right to life than they were as zygotes. A 6-month-old fetus still has no thoughts, no memories of the past, no forecasts of the future. It still lacks the concept of a continuing self, and is therefore not capable of having an interest in its own continued existence. Now, since fetuses of this age can feel pain, Tooley might, just for the sake of having a little moral humility, be inclined to say that they may have some rights, such as a right not to be tortured, just as he might also be inclined to say that cats may have a right not to be tortured. Feeling pain, Tooley would concede, is not nothing, but it is not sufficient on its own to grant fetuses a right to life. For if it was, then we'd also have to grant cats a right to life, and most animals for that matter. Therefore, again, in his estimation, abortion is morally acceptable. Now, hopefully I've explained Tooley's central argument well enough here to move on and answer those people who say that the fetus's potential to become a young man named Carter Brown means that it should have the rights of a young man named Carter Brown. Leave any questions about what I've said thus far in the comments below, but now I am going to move on. One way that Tooley addresses this potential person argument is by first pointing out the fact that the argument we just went through actually makes a pretty good case against it. He would continue by saying that a fetus cannot have an interest in its future life because it is not capable of having an interest in its present life, which means, in his view, that it has no right to its present or future life. A fetus simply isn't capable of having an interest in its potential to be a young man named Carter Brown. So potentialities alone, Tooley would say, cannot endow the unborn, regardless of developmental stage, with the right to life. All in all, folks, I think that Tooley's case against the pro-life perspective as a whole is very impressive. It makes sense. However, that's not the only reason I wanted to discuss it. Allow me to read from Tooley's summary and conclusions. For most of this video, the pro-lifers have probably been the most uncomfortable. But buckle up, pro-choicers, because now it's your turn. Reading from Tooley. In this paper, I have advanced three main philosophical contentions. 1. An entity cannot have a right to life unless it is capable of having an interest in its own continued existence. 2. An entity is not capable of having an interest in its own continued existence unless it possesses at some time the concept of a continuing self or subject of experiences in other mental states. 3. The fact that an entity will, if not destroyed, come to have properties that would give it a right to life does not in itself make it seriously wrong to destroy it. If these philosophical contentions are correct, the crucial question is a factual one. At what point does a developing human being acquire the concept of a continuing self, and at what point is it capable of having an interest in its own continued existence? I have not examined this issue in detail here, but I have suggested that careful scientific studies of human development, both behavioral and neurophysiological, strongly support the view that even newborn humans do not have the capacities in question. If this is right, then it would seem that infanticide during a time interval shortly after birth must be viewed as morally acceptable. Ladies and gentlemen, the title of Tooley's work that I have refrained from mentioning until now is In Defense of Abortion and Infanticide. Oddly enough, perhaps the strongest and most progressive pro-choice argument has the most abhorrent and regressive conclusion. Killing newborn babies. Now that's old school. The reason I find this argument to be so powerful is not just the fact that it's shocking, but that it cannot be ignored by the pro-choice minded person. For if a pro-choicer accepts Tooley's views on abortion based on his premises, then they absolutely have to accept his views on infanticide in order to be logically consistent, for his premises justify both. They can't have one and not the other. So it follows that if the pro-choicer rejects infanticide, then they must reject abortion. If they accept abortion, then they must accept infanticide. This is also true of Mary Ann Warren's reasoning. Now, she does not argue for infanticide in her piece, but her argument does not forbid it. Think about the 5 traits she listed: consciousness, ability to reason, self-motivated activity, the capacity to communicate, the presence of self-concepts, and self-awareness. Now ask yourself, how many of those traits apply to a newborn baby? None. The philosopher Stephen Schwartz wrote a counter-argument to Warren's in which he quotes her to demonstrable effect. I think what I read here shows that Warren isn't all that different from Tooley. Reading from the being in the womb is a person. We can now see Warren's argument for abortion in its entirety. A fetus is a human in the genetic sense. That is morally irrelevant. A fetus is not a human in the moral sense. It is not a person since it satisfies none of the criteria she has outlined. Not being a person, it has no right to life, and abortion is morally permissible. The same applies to the child after birth. Killing a newborn infant isn't murder. Infanticide is wrong, according to Warren, only to the extent that the child is wanted, that there are couples who would like to adopt or keep it. Thus, infanticide is wrong for reasons analogous to those which make it wrong to wantonly destroy natural resources or great works of art. But destroying natural resources or works of art is not always wrong, and certainly not wrong in the sense in which murder is wrong. Warren acknowledges this when she says, "It follows from my argument that when an unwanted or defective infant is born into a society which cannot afford and or is not willing to care for it, then its destruction is permissible." Just as in Tooley's argument, the progressive comes to the most regressive conclusion. Now, I must say that the pro-choice side of this debate has attempted to solve this problem. Louis P. Pojman tried to solve it by making a utilitarian argument. Here's a definition of utilitarianism in case you have no idea what I'm talking about. Utilitarianism, the doctrine that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness, and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. So, Pojman argues that it might bring about more happiness and benefits to a society if newborn babies were granted the right to life. However, even he had to admit that a utilitarian argument could hypothetically be made for protecting unborn babies as well. If a state decided that good reasons existed to extend the social right to life to fetuses, it would be justified in doing so. The utilitarian argument does not hold up under examination. It can be used to refute the entire pro-choice position. So, to bring this baby full circle, is abortion reasonable? Well, as I've demonstrated, yes, it is. So long as you are also willing to accept that infanticide is reasonable. Whether you are pro-choice or pro-life, the ideas of the philosophers discussed in this video deserve to be deeply contemplated and seriously confronted, even if you're a pro-lifer or pro-choicer who finds them appalling. To contextualize your thoughts on all this, please consider checking out the next video in this series called Is Abortion Immoral?, where we will examine several pro-life arguments that counter the pro-choice perspective as a whole, as well as the arguments covered in this video. I promise that if you give it a watch, you'll walk away with a better understanding of both sides of this issue. So I'll see you in the next video.